Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Rosen Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chavla, and as always, I'm really pleased to be joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunella Rosa. This week, we're talking about Liberation Day and all the confusion that it's raising, both in the lead up, but also possibly now that it's happened in the aftermath, in the immediate aftermath of it. Scheduled for April 2nd, this was supposed to be the day that Trump remakes and reorders the global trading system by effectively enacting, almost unprecedented tariffs on dozens of countries, really. Bruno, what did we see during Liberation Day? What actually sort of came out? Because I know there's a lot of confusion going in. And what was the immediate aftermath in the markets? How did the markets react to this?
Yeah, so Liberation Day coincided with this announcement made by Trump of this series of tariffs on a number of countries. He signed yet another, I think, even the two executive orders on that, with the usual scene where he's seen signing and showing, the posters or whatever he's doing. Um, and then effectively being the beginning of a new era for America. We'll get to that. The reciprocal tariffs are a bit of a joke. The calculations came out how they got to that figure, which with some paradoxical examples. So the calculation is simply the trade deficit divided by the exchange between the two countries. With the results that if a country is particularly small compared to the US, say Vietnam, it will look like they are applying something like 90% tariffs on the US, which makes no sense. It's just the proportion of
Mm,
the exchange that is particularly different, considering that the US is so much larger than Vietnam. So this calculation that really leaves left many people wondering how serious these things were actually taken. They actually used to justify that a formula with Greek letters that in theory should signify some sort of sensitivity of trade to tariffs and plus other forms of restrictions. Makes none of this makes any sense. Okay, it would have been more serious to say, look, we believe that we have strong trade imbalance with some partners, being China, being the EU, and we want to address this instead of having this 10% against everybody, justified by unbelievable formulas with some figment of scientific, which they don't have. Okay, so this is as much as Liberation Day is. Point is, though, and we'll discuss this more next week as we will publish a column on that. It actually is an important day. I think this marks the end of the long globalization expansion started by Nixon with his trip to China in 1972. So that's the beginning, and April 2nd, 2025 is the end. Okay? The US does not believe in free trade anymore. It doesn't believe in expanding the pace of globalization, which they believe has only favored China. And guess what? Who wanted China entering the global trade? The US. They went there to divide China from Russia in 1972. They thought it was a good tactical move. Guess what? The US always create the monsters that later on they need to fight. And yet we are here again. Now, unfortunately, globalization has been a very strong force for for a lot of countries, not just the US or China or other, entire segments of the global south have benefited from that. What happens to them from tomorrow onwards? The EU might be impacted, but it's one of the richest areas in the world anyway. They will survive. But what other countries that are listed there? I mentioned Vietnam, but there are others that would be hit by super punitive tariffs they cannot retaliate against. Of course, they can't. They don't even have the strength or the power to negotiate with the US, let alone agree on something. So, it's the end of globalization. As I said, we'll speak about this.
Yeah.
This column and this podcast is more about the reaction by other countries to these announcements.
Yeah. One of the countries where policy was perhaps the most unclear in the first few weeks of Trump's administration is the closest ally, Canada. Canada, which recently went through an internal party election, is now on the brink of calling a snap election. What is happening in Canada, and how is the new prime minister reacting to all of this?
Yeah, so Canada is the perfect example of what I was saying. Trump won, caught almost everybody by surprise. So people didn't even know whether to react, how to react. And it also took quite some time for Trump to implement those tariffs. Plus, its aim was reaching a deal with China, which in fact occurred in January 2020, at the very end of his mandate. So after the tit for tat of the trade war. So initially, in his first mandate, countries didn't know how to react. But now, as people knew that this was coming, they have prepared, and they thought that the best response is being tough. You do not negotiate with Trump by being weak, by saying, "Oh, please give me a favor, a favorable treatment or something." It's not going to work. You need to hit hard. And this is what Canada has understood. Immediately after Trump announced tariffs on Canada and Mexico, Canada retaliated with some of the strongest reactions there. They literally, apart from boycotting all the products coming from the US, the whiskey is the most famous because it's super visible, and that was hitting red states in the US, so hitting the electoral base of Trump. There were retaliation in the energy sector, in the electricity supply, in the exchange that they have for car manufacturing and so on. Plus, the prime minister, the new prime minister, Mark Carney, was super tough. He did his first trip not to the US, his foreign trip not to the US, but to the EU, which is kind of strange if you want, but was very symbolic. And then he made a speech that I think is very important. He said that the old relationship with the US, based on deepening the relationship, the integration between the two economies, it's over. It's like there was a marriage, is now dissolved, everybody needs to go his own way. And this seems to be the only way Trump is willing to get to the table. In fact, he reached out, as Carney said, to discuss. And then you should to communicate. Trump was, yes, I had a discussion, very productive. We are gonna be friends. It's gonna be huge. That kind of stuff. Canada was much more. First of all, when he called, he respected our sovereignty. There was this discussion, this and that. And by the way, Canada would retaliate to the U.S. tariffs, with equally strong tariffs against the U.S., aimed at providing maximum impact on the U.S. economy. So, totally different approach.
Yeah. Canada is sort of one of those regions. Another one is Greenland, which, perhaps very few people have ever thought about in the United States, could perhaps let alone point on a map, but has now become kind of at the fore of Trump's foreign policy somehow. JD Vance made a trip down to Greenland. Could you tell us a little bit, more about sort of what unfolded there, but also what's happening again on the axis with the war in Ukraine and with President Putin?
Yeah, Greenland is interesting because it's one of these neo-imperialist aims of Trump, getting the hold of a massive land that is on the Arctic, that is becoming strategic, and the US wants to get. Ironically, there would be no need to get Greenland. Greenland is part of Denmark. Denmark is a super close ally of the US via NATO. NATO has a basis there, a large one, totally controlled by the Americans. There's no need to do any of this, but clearly it's not enough. Vance went there with his wife. Usha, and then I wasn't a good visit. It wasn't welcome when anywhere. It was turned down in many shops where he wanted to stay, so he had to remain in the military base. Not a good outcome. Much more seriously, although this will become serious, I think, over time, but much more serious right now is the intertwining between tariffs and the war in Ukraine. Now, Trump is saying he's pissed off, these are his words, with Putin, because of course he hasn't signed a ceasefire just yet. And we all remember the propaganda of solving the war in one day. Okay, that was electoral speech is over. It's taking longer than expected. He thought that with a couple of phone calls he would convince Putin, and only Zelensky was the difficult one. Of course, wasn't the case. Putin is as tough as Zelensky and even more resolute. And now he has to threaten him and say, look, if you don't sign, I'm going to hit you with secondary tariffs on Russian oil export, which means that it's not just against Russia, but any country buying Russian oil would be hit. So, it seems like he wants to use tariffs for literally everything. But this is not a good way of conducting economic policy.
Yeah. I mean, if we were to look at it perhaps from, from Trump's perspective, why do you use tariffs? They sort of rarely cite economic reasons per se or anything about the revenue. A lot of it is about tariffs as a negotiation instrument, as an instrument of coercion. Tell me a bit more about what Trump and why Trump sees it that way, and what role Peter Navarro plays in all of this.
Well, Peter Navarro has been a close advisor to Trump on these matters for quite some time and still is. It can be considered the ideologue behind the tariffs. And he says the reason why we are raising tariffs is to finance permanent tax cuts. Why do we want to have tax cuts? Well, to make the country better off. Guess what? As we discussed last week, a Yale study shows it's not the entire country, it's just the 1% of the richest part of the population that is going to be better off. The rest of the remaining 99% is not going to be better off, and actually 40% will be much worse off. And of course, it's the poorer part of the population that will suffer. So we are imposing tariff to cut taxes on the richest part of the US population. Is it worth it? Really? Is it worth it? Having such a huge mess around the globe just to cut taxes to the rich in America? I mean, honestly, I don't understand. But the fact is, as I point out in the column, it's like Turkey voting for Christmas because people voted for them. The point is they don't realize who actually pays the taxes. They got convinced by the Trump propaganda that it's the foreign countries that pay the tariffs. So the Americans just collect those tariffs from foreign countries. It doesn't work that way. You impose a tariff. If the importer imports the good from abroad, it imports at a higher price that is paid, of course, by the importer, and therefore the importer needs to decide, should I pass this on to the end consumer, which of course is in America, or should I absorb the higher price? Most will pass it on, and so eventually it's the end consumer, so it's the American citizen that pays those tariffs. How can the turkey vote for Christmas? Well, that's the propaganda machine for you.
And this all comes down in the sort of showdown after the Signal Chatgate, as it's called, where Pete Hegseth, the sort of Fox News presenter turned Secretary of Defense, was seen sort of leaking effectively war plans on a unsecure channel like that. Very quickly, what do you make of that?
Well, it's just part of the huge confusion that is ongoing. Somebody from the administration says chaos, okay, in DC, where it seems like everybody is trying to do something more or less to please Trump, but with very mixed results. We have seen about the protest against Doge. We have seen the mess in the Pentagon, where with the Chatgate and further scandals where apparently Hegseth White was admitted in some private meetings where she didn't have enough clearance. All these things don't work out well. All this reminds me how ironic the situation has been if we put everything together, right? We built NATO, as Lord Dismay said once, it was British, one of the British greatest soldiers, to have Americans in, Germans down, and Russia out. And guess what? We are having Americans out, the Germans up again, and the Russians in. Is it worth it? I don't think so. But we'll have time to discuss where all this will lead us in the next few years.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly no going away of all this volatility. So much of which we'll keep to discussing the next few weeks. As always, Brunello, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you very much. Until next time.